Hi again, everyone, and welcome to another video here from Mad About Madeira. Now, it's been some time since I've done a video. Gave you guys a break for a while, but it's been quite some time since I've actually done a video, and I have a new phone, so I hope the video quality is even better. I don't know if that's a good thing because now you can probably see all up in my nose and everywhere else, but I just decided to go ahead and do a video after watching a couple of videos by a YouTuber that I don't necessarily follow. I am not a follower of his channel. I may go ahead and add him, but I've seen a few videos from him, and his videos generally deals with Africa. Now, this is a video I did not necessarily. I shouldn't say I didn't want to do. I mean, I want to do the video, but one of the reasons I balked at doing the video initially is because this channel is about Madeira, yes. And again, most of the videos that you're going to see out here about Madeira are tourist-based, or videos about the beauty of Madeira, people moving to Madeira, people's experiences in Madeira, and so on. Obviously, we're not there as yet, so I can't do any videos from over there and showing you our lives living in Madeira. It's still something in the works for right now, and it's still something that we want to do. So in the meantime, I guess we're sitting here and gives me things to talk about when it comes to Madeira. Well, the interesting thing about it is that today's video is not going to be much about Madeira, to be honest with you. It's going to be more to do with Portugal itself. And this video, as you watch all the way through, may come over as controversial to some people. And I want you to know I don't necessarily back away from controversial subjects. It's not me. One of the things I do, though, is that I try to be respectful to people. I try to be respectful to people's opinions, whether I agree with them or not, and I try to respond in a respectful way. I try not to go after people's character. I try not to make it about the person, but try to just keep it strictly on the subject of whatever they're responding with. So I want you to understand that, and hopefully that spreads over into the comment section, that people can just respond to people's comments without getting all hot and bothered and start to argue with people and start to call people names and so on, okay? That's not really me. And I hope that also spreads over to the comment section under the videos that I do create. Now, excuse the noise that you might be hearing out here. I'm near the road. Hopefully my voice is still coming through loud and clear, that it's not distorted, or you can hear what I'm saying. I'm trying to speak as loud as I possibly can without screaming. Now, again, I mentioned I don't necessarily back away from controversial topics. I do have strong opinions on certain things. It doesn't mean that my views cannot change, and that's one thing that I am proud of myself about, is the fact that I have been a person, though I am very opinionated and I have strong opinions, I tend to try to be as objective as I possibly can, number one. And number two, if information comes up that I can verify as valid, that going through my mental process I can see the value or the truth in the thing, I will go ahead and change my views. And why do I say that? You have to understand, and this is a whole other story, but for example, I'm a person that grew up as an evangelical Christian. I had very strong Christian beliefs, very narrow-minded Christian beliefs. I had beliefs about gay people, that were filtered through my religious beliefs. Once I discarded those religious beliefs, I now see them as just people. They may have different desires, they may have different passions, different likes, but they're people just like me with my own passions, my own likes, my own preferences. I had strong opinions about Jews. And when I say Jews, I don't mean it necessarily in a negative way, but opinions that they could do, well, I shouldn't say not they, but their country could do, well, the country of Israel, the state of Israel could do no wrong. everything was ordained by God, and whatever they're going through or whatever they're doing must be right because God is orchestrating everything. I had strong negative opinions about Muslim people, again, because it filtered through my Christian beliefs. Those are all things that have been thrown to the wayside. My views have changed. I'm more empathetic. I'm more understanding. So when it comes to views and changing them, this is the thing that you would hope in life, that as you grow, as you mature, as evidence comes your way, that your views can change about certain things. And in my case, that is what has happened. And it's going to tie right in with what I'm talking about here, or what I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So getting back to the video, and what I just spoke about, that's for a whole other video. That may be something more on a personal note, that I may do a video so you can get to know me a little bit better and what I'm more or less all about, okay? But going back to this YouTube creator, his channel is, and this brother's gonna have to pay me for some publicity here. His channel is GOBLACK2AFRICA. That's G-O Black and the number 2 and the word Africa. So GOBLACK2, the number Africa. GOBLACK2AFRICA. So I come across his videos every now and again. Should have put this phone on no disturb so no one disturbs me. But anyway, I go through his videos, and some of his videos, and I've seen him talk about Africa because I also have an interest in Africa. You know, some people may look and think, oh, well, this guy is only interested in Portugal, he's only interested in Madeira. But my interests, I'm a geography geek, as I've mentioned before. I'm into geography. I love learning about other cultures. I love learning about other people. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of my views have changed, because as I've gotten to know people, read about people, realize that other parts of the world, people live differently, people think differently, people see things differently. And if I had to look at the world revolving around my opinions, well, it would be a very sad existence, you know? But anyway, I watch his videos, or some of them I should say. He's talking about Africa, you know, I watch. But then what caught my attention is I looked up and I saw the little thumbnail of one of his videos, and I happened to notice he was in Portugal. I said, oh, he's in Portugal. Wow, okay. Let me see what he's talking about. But I could see by the title of the video, it was something to do with slavery or something along that line. And as some of you may have seen in some of my other videos, I have people in my family and I have friends. When I went to Portugal, you could kind of tell the little, like, you went to Portugal? You went to Portugal? You know, don't you know those people, like, enslaved our people? What are you doing going over to that country? So I've touched on that before, because some of these people come to me thinking that I have no clue about Portugal's history. And when I went over there, I just went over there not knowing anything about the history. And if I did, oh wow, you would just be shocked and you would be stunned and you would never go to that country. And I've hinted at the fact that these people are rather clueless to know the type of person they're dealing with when it comes to me in terms of me understanding history, including Portugal's history. So this gentleman from the channel Go Black to Africa, he goes to Portugal, and the first video that I saw from him, he's standing in front of that monument down in Lisbon, right off the Tagus River. We were there, my wife and I were there when we were going to Portugal. We stayed in Lisbon for a couple of days, so we did manage to get down there to that monument. So I remember the monument, and I looked up, and he was pointing to all the figures in the monument, and he was talking about what it was really all about. Then he goes on and he says that Portugal was the first country. He kept saying the first country, but I guess he meant to say the first European country that was involved in the transatlantic slave trade, or they were the architects, I guess you could say the pioneers, I guess I should say, in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. He is 100% correct. 100% correct in what he says. Now, I know there may be Portuguese, Madeirans who are listening to this video. Stick with me, okay? This is not a video to pile on Portugal or the Portuguese people. Just stick with me. You'll see where this is going to go. And I'm going to try to be as objective as possible here. I don't have a skin in the game, so to speak. I am a black man. I am of African descent. But of course, I also have Portuguese ancestry. Of course, I'm sure ancestry from other places. Also, but Portugal was a relatively recent entry into my family line, starting in about the mid-1800s, whereby my African ancestry goes back, wow, in terms of it being on this side of the world, goes back probably 300-400 years for as far as I know. But for the Portuguese side, the 1800s onward up to modern times, okay? So he was there and he was talking about slavery and everything. I agree with him 100%. And if you're Portuguese, unless you're in a state of denial, you know this to also be true. But a lot of times when that is thrown out, it is thrown out without a context. It is thrown out as a fact, but detached and devoid of a context in where to put that. This has nothing to do with me justifying, by any stretch of the imagination, of anyone enslaving anyone else. And in this case, we're speaking about the Portuguese and their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, because they were instrumental in bringing a lot of African people from the African continent to the Americas, notably Brazil. Okay? So they were very instrumental. They were a very big part of the whole movement of Africans from the continent of Africa over to the Americas. Now, when I speak about context, I am a person because I'm into history, I'm very big on perspective. I'm very big on history. I realize that nothing necessarily happens in a vacuum. Like the Portuguese didn't just wake up one day and decide, you know what, let's start this new thing called the transatlantic slave trade. It didn't go like that. It wasn't like something that just happened just like that. There were things that led up to it. There were events that led up to it. There were chance encounters that led up to this. And the first thing is, which a lot of people don't talk about because they normally talk about the positive side of this, is that prior to the transatlantic slave trade, on the continent of Africa, launched from the coast of what we call Morocco today, the northern coast, the Mediterranean coast of Morocco, from an area we call Ceuta, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, or Queta, C-U-E-T-A, the Moors from Africa. Of course, it was a mixture of Arabs and North Africans, people who converted to Islam. They launched an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula from Morocco, what we call Morocco today. I think that area is called the Zagreb, I think, back then. But they launched an invasion of the Iberian Peninsula, which today it's Spain and Portugal, in 711. They came over and they conquered much of the peninsula. They came over, conquered, and spread northward, west, east, until they conquered much of the peninsula. I think the only place that held out was the extreme northwestern portion of Spain, what we call Spain today, beyond the Pyrenees Mountains, and that area became known as Andalus, or Andalusia, if I'm not mistaken. So in doing so, the Moors were there for 800 years, basically, before they were finally completely expelled from the Iberian Peninsula and lost their grip on at least the portion that they had left, which was in southern Spain today, called Granada. So after they did that, and they conquered the area and they were there for that long, there's usually a focus on the fact that the Moors brought civilization to the peninsula, that they brought advancement to the peninsula. And that is also a fact. There were things that the Muslims, who in conquering places like India and Iran and other places, Persia as it was called back then, and parts of India and Indonesia, that they learned a lot of things that traveled along their network of areas that they conquered, all the way across North Africa, the Middle East, North Africa, that ended up in places like Iberia. Things like algebra, things about science, the arts, different things that they brought in. So by bringing this in, they did infuse civilization into the area. So they were positives that they brought. And there's a lot of focus on that. I will see memes about the Moors brought civilization to Europe. While the Europeans were in the Dark Ages, the Moors brought enlightenment and so on. And that is all true. But there's still an elephant in the room in the fact that the Moors invaded other people's lands, that they conquered other people, that they subjugated other people, and these other people were Europeans, and subjugated them and put them on their thumb and under their will. Now, of course, in some regards, they did allow certain freedoms, and they were much better than probably some other conquerors throughout the course of history, because they had like a strata of the Muslims are up here, and then you have the Jews and the Christians. And they did offer some level of respect because these people were considered people of the book. In other words, that they were all part of the Abrahamic faiths. So there was some level of civility somewhere along the line. Okay? But still, they were invaders. They were occupiers in other people's territories. So, in 1492, when the Spanish, and I'm going to try to see if I can narrow this thing down, when the Spanish and the Portuguese eventually expelled their Moorish population, or overthrew them, like tell them to get out of here, we finally took it back in what was called a Reconquista. Portugal eventually emerged and started growing. But prior to this, Portugal already started to spread its wings, actually. Because remember, over time, the Moorish influence or control over the land began to wane. So it wasn't like overnight, like the whole area of Iberia just became liberated. It was a progressive type of thing. But it was when they got down to Granada in 1492, the last stronghold. That was the area that was the last place that the Iberians had to recapture. And when they did, that basically ended all Moorish rule that was going on anywhere on the Iberian Peninsula at the time. But prior to that, in areas that were already liberated or had already gotten rid of their Moorish overlords, like Portugal, they began to spread their wings. So not surprising. This was in 1492, mind you. But prior to that, a few decades before that, Portugal had already started to make some moves. And one of the things that Portugal did, and you have to understand that during this time, at the end of the Moorish occupation, there was a big war, or big wars going on further east in Palestine that were known as the Crusades. There was a war being waged between the Christians and the Muslims, and the Christians trying to take back Jerusalem from the Muslims, or the Muslims trying to take back Jerusalem, or the Holy Land, as they would call the area, or take it back from the Christians. So while that's going on across in the Eastern Mediterranean, on the Western Mediterranean, there was an extension of that war. So the Christians in Iberia saw it as their duty to also fight against the Muslims that were around them. And the closest place you can find these Muslims were in their territory, or in their land of Iberia, or Andalusia, whatever you may want to call it at that time. And of course, the Muslims were just right across the Straits of Gibraltar, in places like Morocco, what we call Morocco today. So keep in mind, and this is a little trivia, the Moors considered what we call Portugal today, they call it Gab al-Andalus, and I may be pronouncing this completely incorrect. In other words, they looked at the area we call Spain today as Andalusia, and then they looked at the area to the west of that as Garb Andalus, which means west of Andalus. And so we got the word Gab, al, west of, and we got the word Algarve to this very day, which is the southern area of Portugal. But anyway, once Portugal began to flex its muscle, it decided, as part of the overall crusade that was going on in Europe, they decided, you know what, let's go over to Zagreb, or over to what we call Morocco today, and we're going to go ahead and wage war on the Muslims who are over there as part of the greater Crusade conflict. And they went over to the city of Ceuta, or Ceuta, I forgot to look up the pronunciation, that's C-U-E-T-A, which is right on the tip, northern tip of Morocco, which is where the Moors 800 years earlier had launched their military campaign of invasion over into Iberia. And they went down and they decided to wage war on the Muslims there, and they defeated the Muslims on the King John of Portugal. But while King John was there waging this war, he had a few of his sons with him who were there to earn their stripes, so to speak. And one of those sons, his name was Henry. Henry was one of the younger ones and was not exactly in line to be king. So he took his money, he took his fame from the war, and he decided, well, I'm not going to be king. Let me invest it in something else. And he invested in navigation. So he decided to build a school on the southern tip of Portugal and said, you know what, I'm going to open a school to teach navigators, because Portugal is, after all, right on the sea. It's right on the Atlantic Ocean, on its northern side. On its southern side, I think it's also on the, I don't know if the Mediterranean, I'm not even sure. But the southern side may be the Mediterranean. I'm not looking at a map right now. I don't know if they're on there. Well, you know what? Yeah. So they're all on the Atlantic Ocean, because the Strait of Gibraltar right there kind of dissects or separates the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. So they're on the water. So you figure, what are they going to get themselves involved in? Water. Let's figure out this thing called the ocean. Let's figure out what we can do. So in 1419, he starts funding, sponsoring explorations. And one of those explorations in 1419 led to the discovery of the island of Madeira, or the islands of Madeira, which of course includes Porto Santo. And other expeditions led to other places. So these guys are out there exploring, they're going out in the waters, taking a little bit more risk and going a little further, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. They start to build more navigable ships that could take them further, that could sail against the wind. And I think they came up with a ship called a caravel, and they started sailing further and further. So they started sailing further east, further west from the mainland Portugal, and also further south. Further south now brought them along the coast of Africa. Now, Morocco was there, they were aware of that. But now they started sailing beyond Morocco, sailing down the western coast of Africa, and eventually started coming more in contact with local African peoples on the continent. And in doing so, they eventually came across something that was also common in Europe. They came across people who were enslaved. This is nothing new to the Portuguese. This is something that was also going on in Europe also. They came down, they saw what was going on. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they managed to capture or kidnap a few local Africans who I don't think were from sub-Saharan Africa. They were from the northern part of Africa. So more along the line of Moors, perhaps, or Berbers, or who they captured. They brought them back to Europe, to Portugal. And when they brought them back, these Berbers, because one of the things about slavery back then was you still had some humanity there. You still could negotiate your price for your freedom. And these Berbers, or these Moors, told the Portuguese, hey, listen, you know what? If you free us, we can bring you more people like us. As a matter of fact, there are markets down here in our continent where there are people who are selling people to work, to do your hard labor. And so the Portuguese believe this, and they took these Berbers back home, and I think these Berbers promised that if you set us free, we'll bring you 10 people that you can take back. And so the Portuguese go, they follow through, and these Berbers did live up to their promise, and they brought sub-Saharan Africans to them and said, here, as we promised. The Portuguese took them back, and before you know it, the transatlantic slave trade was going to begin in earnest. I say that Because another thing that's often overlooked in the chapter of the transatlantic slave trade, it's gotten more publicity of late, but another thing that's been overlooked, and again, none of what I'm going to say excuses the Portuguese or Europeans from their part in the transatlantic slave trade. But it cannot be overlooked that it just didn't happen by Portuguese showing up with guns and bombs and missiles and went into the interior of Africa and decided they're just going to go ahead and kidnap Africans out of the continent. That was near impossible back in those days. In order for this to really go off, this venture of the transatlantic slave trade to become what it became, it needed cooperation by local people. Please understand that not all African tribes, not all African kings were engaged in the enslavement or capturing of other Africans and bringing them to the coast and passing them on to the Europeans. Please understand that. But there were more than enough African kings, African tribes, who realized that there was a profit to be made by capturing rival tribes on their continent and selling them off to the Europeans to be enslaved and taken across into the Americas. So again, this is a very complex thing, and it's nothing I can explain within a 30-minute video. Let's see how far I am. 20 minutes, I think. I'm wearing these shades, so it's hard for me to see. So I'm going to try to see if I can really bring this down. But anyway, they go and they come down, the Europeans, the Portuguese, the initial the pioneers. They go down and they meet willing partners, willing business partners. So the Portuguese will come in from, of course, their colonies or wherever they had, of course, they had sailed all the way to the east, to India, bringing back merchandise and certain goods. And they would come to the African leaders and like, hey, we'll trade you this if you bring these people over to us. Because remember, Portugal is a small country, and they were discovering, doesn't mean that people weren't there, right? But they were discovering these lands, or coming into these lands, these vast lands that were much bigger than where they came from. And they could not get enough of their people to come over to work on these colonies that they were building up. So the next best thing, and of course we already know what was happening with the local people living in these colonies that they met there, they were dying off from diseases. So they went to Africa and they brought over Africans instead, who were a little bit more sturdy and could handle the tough work that was there. So there were African kings who were realizing the Portuguese will bring them merchandise, fine clothing from India, would bring them alcohol or rum from their cane colonies in certain places like Madeira, which is, believe it or not, Madeira was actually a colony of Portugal. Okay? Was actually a colony of Portugal. And that's where Portugal sort of built a template for how they were going to spread out this template into other places like Brazil. So the Portuguese are bringing goods, hand them over to these African kings, these tribal chiefs, and say, hey, I'll give you this, you give me what I want, and so on. But there was also a key thing that happened on the continent of Africa that really put the transatlantic slave trade on steroids. And that was, there was an empire in Western Africa known as the Songhai Empire. Great empire that followed on the heels of the Mali Empire. The Songhai Empire, of course, included famous cities like Timbuktu. And the region also produced, not the Songhai Empire, but it also produced great men like Mansa Musa. In that area, slavery was a thing. Mansa Musa built his great empire because of enslaved people who went and dug in the gold mines to make him the wealth that he ended up having. Another thing that's often overlooked in terms of talking about his fortune. The gold just didn't show up in his lap. He had to have people going out there to do that, and this included enslaved Africans, people who looked just like him. So the Songhai Empire was there, and of course, the Songhai Empire, it assumed a lot of the Mali Empire that came before them. And in doing so, to hold this empire together, there were a lot of different tribes from a lot of different regions that had to be conquered and brought together under a unified government, under the king or kings of Songhai. Well, around the late 1500s, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was around the late 1500s or late 1400s, I forgot, I want to say it's the 1500s, the Songhai Empire eventually met its end. And believe it or not, it met its end not because of Europeans. It met its end because of another African country or another kingdom on the continent of Africa. That kingdom happened to be the Kingdom of Morocco. The same Morocco that a few centuries earlier got into scuffles with the Portuguese. The Moroccans came down hearing about the gold and everything coming out of sub-Sahara Africa. And the Sahara Desert had always presented a barrier between northern Africa and what went on below or south of the Sahara. But the Moroccans, in their encounters with the Portuguese and being on the northern part of the continent of Africa and having a lot of connections with Europe, they eventually got a new weapon in hand that the Africans didn't have, at least not in any great numbers. Guns, cannons. And they decided this is our chance to make our move on what is going on south of the Sahara. And it happened to be Songhai, where gold was just all around the place like it was just water. So they go down there and they eventually struck a death blow on the empire of Songhai. When they did that, the empire fractured, naturally. The Moroccans couldn't stick around because they were a small army. A lot of the soldiers had died along the way, and it was always going to be a challenge to try to manage peoples on the other side of the Sahara. So it became very difficult. So they struck the death blow, but then they had to eventually leave. But by striking the death blow, it broke up the empire. So now all these tribes that were once dominated and under one central rule by the king or kings of Songhai, they now found themselves free. And what you had was a bunch of intertribal warfare. They're going to fight. Some were fighting to retain that independence they gained. Some were trying to fight to bring back the empire together, to try to bring these tribes all back together and bring them back onto one central government, but it was not to be. It was in this division and in all this tribal fighting going on, the Europeans are sitting there watching and seeing all this going on, all this division, all this interfighting. And they're sitting there looking on, and it's like, hey, look what they're doing. They're fighting against one another. We'll just sit here and wait. What happens now, you have war captives. All this fighting going on, you have war captives. The Europeans, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, they're sitting around and saying, hey, we can take those war captives off your hand. Just sell them to us. Oh, you will? Yeah, we'll take them off your hands. Those are your enemies, right? If we take them off your hands and get rid of them altogether, you won't have to worry about retaliation. We'll take them away. Get rid of them for you. Make them disappear. Oh? And not only that, we'll give you some trinkets, guns, weapons, and you can take those guns and weapons and go in there and do some more conquering. And when you conquer those tribes or defeat those tribes, it brings you more human commodities for us to take off your hands. You're making money. We'll give you the supplies and the tools you need to go in there and do the dirty work. You bring them to us. We take them off your hands. Match made in hell. And so the transatlantic slave trade just began in earnest. But a lot of it had to do with the cooperation of the local Africans, where if there wasn't any of that, we might be talking about something entirely different. There would have probably been resistance, there would have probably been wars, long protracted wars, whatever would have gone on. But you have to understand, a big reason why the transatlantic slave trade was successful for so long is because of the participation of some African tribes, some African tribal leaders, who basically saw the profit in doing this. And one of the big places was what we call the country of Benin today, or in that area of Nigeria, because there was a man from the colony of Brazil. His name was Felix De Sousa, and he somehow made his way over to what we call Benin today. And when he got there, the first thing he did was, or one of the first things he did, was he engaged in assisting in a coup where one particular individual, forgot his name, overthrew the reigning king in the kingdom of, well, it was called Dahomey back then, in the kingdom of Dahomey. And once the coup took place, the new king, the person who Felix De Sousa assisted, decided, hey, you know what, for helping me out, I'm gonna put you in charge of this whole slave trading thing we got going on here. And Felix De Sousa, with his connections and whatever, really opened up the slave market in Dahomey. And before you know it, Dahomey became like this place that was just like pouring in the enslaved Africans into Brazil. And so while other places it had died down, or while in other places like the French and the British, when they ended the slave trade, Brazil was still engaged in this. Remember, Brazil didn't end the Portuguese, at least on mainland Portugal, had ended slavery back in the 1700s, if I'm not mistaken. On the mainland, that is. The British ended their transatlantic slave trade in 1803, if I'm not mistaken. And other European kingdoms followed suit. Brazil went on until 1898. And Dahomey was like their biggest trading partner, just funneling more and more in. And why was this possible? It was possible because the kings of Dahomey saw the profit in doing so, in still engaging in the slave trade. So all of this are things that needs to be considered when we're looking into the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The Europeans, there's blame that still needs to be laid at their feet for things that transpired, and them pioneering it and them exploiting it and doing whatever was best for them. Made them a lot of wealth. There was a lot of human misery because of their engaging in it. On the African side, the same exact thing. Because you had some, again, I keep using the word some, because I don't want anyone to think or say that this guy in Madeira is over there saying that the Africans were out there, and it's like, okay, well, we can just wash our hands because it was the Africans' fault. No, this was a partnership. It went on both sides because it was all about profit. And when it comes down to these things, a lot of times, not because people, now, the result of slavery, racism and everything, that's going to involve hate to keep that going. But when this thing was going on, it was more or less like, it's just business. Nothing personal, just business. I need to sell you to make some money. Just like people do out here nowadays. I don't know you from Adam. I don't hate you. I don't know who you are, but I'm going to sell you this poison. I'm going to give you this poison for you to get addicted to. I don't really hate you. I just don't know who you are, but I'm making a profit. Same exact thing back then. And so goes the story. Now, to get back to, so I said whatever I just had to say. I know it was like really, there's a whole lot more that could be said, a whole lot more that could be explained, because this is a very long, complicated history of the transatlantic slave trade, and that's a whole other thing that will take a million videos to probably cover every detail. But for this this YouTuber, GOBLACK2AFRICA, he did another video that I caught, and the video was with him in Lisbon, and he said that he was there because of his wife, she wanted to go there. He didn't sound like he wanted to be there, and I don't know if he's the type of person that was like, I'm not going to go over there, that's the enemy over there. I really don't know what he's thinking. Maybe I'm not going to think for the guy, but he said he's there because of his wife, which makes it sound like he didn't want to go, or he wouldn't have gone if it was not for his wife. So in the second video that he has, he's talking about Lisbon, and he's showing an area of Lisbon where there are a lot of Africans who gather there. And I guess the place is called Rousseau or something like that, he said it's called. And a lot of the Africans who gather there. So in the background, as he has his video panning, you see a lot of black people behind him. And he said a lot of them are from Guinea-Bissau in Africa. But as he was talking and he was walking, a gentleman walked past with his son, and his son started waving in the camera. And I guess he decided to stop and, hey, can I talk to you guys? And he asked the gentleman, where is he from? The gentleman says that he's from Senegal. And he said, you're from Senegal and you're in Portugal? And he says, how is it here in Portugal? How is it? What is it like? And the guy said, I have no problems. He actually likes it. He said he's currently living in France. And the guy asked him, the guy from Go Black to Africa, he says, so what about France? And he says, France is more dangerous than Lisbon. And I guess it caught the guy by surprise. And then the guy from Senegal, who he was interviewing, kind of just said, in Portugal, I never had a problem. In Lisbon, I like it here. How long did you live here? He asked him. He said, 15 years. He said, 15 years? He said, yes. He said, I never had no problem. It brought a smile to my face because it's kind of what I thought in terms of Portugal. It does not mean that Portugal doesn't have racist people. I'm sure it does. Okay? It doesn't mean that Portugal, there are not instances, because I've seen some instances where there have been things that would be considered racist. Police officers against there are black people there and so on. But it doesn't seem like it's an epidemic, as you may find in other places. And from what I can see from when I was there, and of course I was there briefly, I just saw black people walking around the place, and I know I've mentioned this before. I just didn't get that sense of, we hate those people over there, we don't like them, they need to get out of our country, things that you hear in the United States, of course, the great United States. I just didn't get that vibe, I just didn't get that feeling. And this guy from Senegal seemed to express that. And it seems like the guy from Go Black to Africa, it looks like he had spoken to a few other people in the crowd prior to him doing the video, and they were like, we don't have a problem here. It's cool. I'm sure there are things they would like to be better, but it didn't seem like in Portugal they were receiving the same kind of vibe that they were getting, that you would hear about in other places. Seems like they were just there existing, just living their lives, no one necessarily bothering them, you know, and I thought that was pretty cool. I really thought it was pretty cool, because I have this opinion about Portugal. And again, I was only there for a few days, but just from the vibe that I checked, Portugal, for all of its glory, for all of its bad, for all of its good, for all of its ugliness in its history, over the centuries, for the most part, seems like in modern times, because, you know, Portugal was like one of the last European country to still try to cling on to colonies in Africa. But ever since their revolution back in 1973, the Coronation Revolution, Portugal has seemed to just be content with minding its own business, staying in its own corner, not going out there dropping bombs in other countries and drones and getting involved in the affairs of other people's business, going into the Middle East or going into Africa and getting themselves involved in anything. It seems like they just pretty much mind their own business. And it seems like it's paying off. You're not going to necessarily hear about terrorist bombings in Portugal. Not to say it can't happen, but you're not going to necessarily hear about that. Because they just seem to just stay away from the drama. Stay over in their little corner. Now I know Portugal is nowhere near as prosperous as it was 500 years ago. It's not dominating portions of the world like it did 500 years ago. But for the most part, right now, understanding its history, it is just basically staying out of the way, staying in its corner, staying out of people's business, and at the same time also seem to be an extremely welcoming country. Now, in the video, the guy mentioned something else that I have been talking about Americans coming in, about people coming in from other parts of the world, and the price of things going up, which may lead to resentment in the future. But for right now, it seems like everyone is coexisting. It's a very welcoming country. It's a very safe country, which is one of the things that the guy from Senegal mentioned. He said France is more dangerous, in his estimation, He can't speak for everyone else, he said, but France is more dangerous than Portugal is. At least he was speaking about Lisbon. And if he's thinking Lisbon, the big city, is safer than in France, imagine the rest of the country out in the rural areas. And I know from going to Madeira, I felt that same sense of safety. So Portugal may not be the most prosperous European country. It may not be the most visited, but there's a certain charm about the place. There's a certain thing about the place, a certain it about the place that appeals to a lot of people who are moving there. And for those people who have asked me in the past, like, what was it like with black people over there? How did they treat you guys? Well, just listening to this man from Senegal and the other Africans that were in that square around the gentleman, it seems like they're just living their lives. And no one is really bothering them. Now, I know when it comes to Africans from the continent and black people from other parts of the world, there may be certain different opinions about the two different groups. You know, they may be looking at a person like me coming from the United States and think I'm more educated. They may think that I may have more money, that I'm more cultured. They may look at it like that compared to Africans with all of the negative stereotypes that have been handed down and people still hold on to. They may look at the Africans as being more dirty, less civilized, less educated, which is not always the case by any stretch. I don't know if that's how it's being perceived or that's how it's looked at. But for as far as I know, as a black man coming from the United States, with my roots being in the Caribbean, I was treated with respect. No one looked at me suspiciously. I didn't feel any sense of eyes looking at me, piercing at me. And me being in Madeira, me and my wife going out to a couple of restaurants with our cousin, who is from Madeira, him and his family, and no one looking at us strangely, no one making us feel weird. We were just there. They weren't even paying attention to us for the most part, other than to bring us whatever we were eating. My wife and I went out to restaurants on our own, had pleasant conversations. For our anniversary dinner, there were Portuguese people serving us. The owner was Italian. They sat down with us. We had these beautiful conversations. You know, like we were eating, the person who came and helped us out with our food and everything, it was truly amazing because we gave her a tip and she smiled so much throughout the whole thing, even before we gave her the tip. She was so helpful. And they gave us a table for ourselves, like a little area of the restaurant by us, because it was for our anniversary. We were going to sit somewhere else amongst everyone else. And they were like, you know what? Look at that table over there. Why don't you sit there? And they gave us this nice little booth, nice ambiance, our own little private area for my wife and I. And it was just such a beautiful thing. The other patrons in the place, they weren't looking around like, oh my God, look, black people. It wasn't anything like that at all. It felt so good. So I know I said a whole lot and went all around the place, and this video has gone all over the place. And I know there are going to be people coming down in the comments. And if the YouTuber from GOBLACK2AFRICA can come in here and see what I'm talking about, I'm sure he's going to have a different opinion from me with certain things, because I could tell by some of his videos, his views are going to probably be a little bit different from mine in certain things. No harm meant, brother. There's nothing there. I had to use your video just to make this video and just to explain a few things. So again, this video had nothing really to do about Madeira. It was mentioned a few times. It has more to do with Portugal and its history, and a very, very narrowing of that history, because I could not get into everything. But I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you may have learned something, and maybe you may teach me something. But I really appreciate you viewing this video. I'm thankful for you guys who have subscribed to the channel. If any of you know the YouTuber from GOBLACK2AFRICA, you can let him know, point him to the video, share it with him. Let him know what I'm saying about his video. I enjoyed looking at the video. I enjoyed what he was saying in a lot of respects. I agreed with quite a bit of the things that he was saying. And I know he himself was doing a very short video and he could not get deep into it. But I am not one of those people that's going to go ahead and look around and say, well, the Portuguese, they did this. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go to Spain because of this and whatever. The land didn't do anything to anyone. I don't mind visiting the lands. Now, you may feel a certain way about the people, but the land of Spain, the land of Portugal didn't do anything to anybody. These are beautiful places to go and visit. Maybe places to go to live. And I'm going to visit the hell out of all of them when I get a chance. Okay? I see people as they come. I don't go ahead and judge entire groups of people and say, well, they're all this or they're all that. I don't. I see people as they come. You come to me with respect. You come to me with decency. You approach me with that respect. I do the very same thing to you. And as a matter of fact, that's how I approach people. I don't make any assumptions. Well, he's white, he must be. No. Or he's Muslim, he must be. No. He's gay, he must be. No. Going back to what I said at the beginning, these are how my views have changed over my lifetime. I treat people as they come. Okay? Anyway, thank you for sticking all the way through and watching this extremely long video. I hope it was interesting to you. And I would love to hear your comments, love to hear what you have to say. I would greatly appreciate it. I hope I was as objective as possible in just this short little video. And this was not a video in a comprehensive understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. I just kind of just peppered it in with as much as I can to try to bring this video under less than 1 hour. Thank you so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. Let me head on home to the family. Can't wait to see what you have to say down in the comments. I certainly appreciate it, okay? Thank you guys so much. Share the video, like, dislike if you want to. It was great seeing you guys again. If I can see it through my screen there. It was great having you guys viewing, okay? You guys take care. Until the next video from Mad About Madeira.